Hey, welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at building a baby bed. I've got a grandson on the way. I'm going to build a baby bed out of white oak. I've got a drawing we're going to take a look at. Okay, I've produced this little old drawing here. Of course, you can see it's depicting the three sides of the baby bed with slats here on the left. So those slats are going to be a item we're going to have to produce, and there's several of those. And then the front and the two sides will be three separate sub-assemblies that I'm going to produce that'll all be glued together. And then those will be fastened together with mechanical fasteners so that it can be broken down for storage or to get in and out through doors and whatnot. I went ahead and purchased a inexpensive bed off Facebook Marketplace so that I could have the box spring portion of it and some measurements that I needed to get for safety purposes as far as gap between slats and measurements from the mattress to the top rail and things like that. I'm going to build this whole thing out of rough sawn white oak that I sawed with my LT10 several years ago. It's been stacked drying. They are about 1 1/8 inches thick, so that's the entirety of the material I have to build this out of. So like these slats are going to be 3/8 thick, so I'm going to take the 1-bys and split them with a bandsaw to get down to 3/8 thick slats. The corner posts are going to be, for the most part, as thick of material as I can plane out and dress up out of these 1-bys. Once I get these three side sub-assemblies produced, then I'm going to build this back. I've drawn it separate so that it would be easier to see. It's going to be a raised panel headboard for a full-size bed down the road. So you could connect bed rails to it. So my intention with this video isn't to give you a step-by-step how-to build this particular baby bed. However, I do have hours of video footage. I don't think it'll play well on my channel to put hours of this up on here. So I'm just going to give a kind of a quick overview of the building of this baby bed. This headboard is going to be assembled using stile and rail joinery. The slats are going to be held in using mortise and tenon joinery. The sub-assemblies are going to be held together with floating tenons. We're going to start the video out where I've already dressed up the lumber from the rough sawn state and trimmed around knots and stuff to end up with some clean lumber. The first thing we're going to start on is the slats, so we'll get going on that. Okay, so I've chosen some of the thickest 1-bys that I can true up with the planer to make these slats out of, because when I split them, I need them to be a full 3/8. And of course that's 3/8 and they're finished on both sides. So here I'm just blocking out some of these boards that are going to end up and be the slats. So I'm actually cutting everything about 1 inch over length while I'm working on getting it all machined up, and then eventually I'll cut them to a final length, but until I get them all machined up and trued up, I'm not going to worry about that for now. I'm also picking through this lumber pretty hard on these because I'm cutting them down to some pretty small pieces, so I need it to be really straight grain. I need it to be really clean. No knots, no pin knots, no peculiar angled grains. Now I've got some of these pieces over at the table saw, and I'm going to rip them into a little over 1.75 wide pieces. 1.75 is what I want my final dimension to be. So I'm going to rip some of these up real quick, and then we'll take them to the bandsaw. Splitting these slats out of these 1-bys wasn't too bad. It just a lot of repetitive over and over to get it done. Since this is a repetitive, we'll see if we can't just hurry this along here just a little bit and speed this up. I'm showing a few of these, but there's actually about 3 times as many of these as I'm showing being worked up here by the time we get them all done. Here's a pretty good look at a little stack of them, and I'll show you a couple of them where they're split open here. And of course the next progression in these slats is to plane them on that rough side just to smooth it back out, but also to get them all exactly the same thickness, because if you've ever ripped something with a bandsaw like that, you don't always get them exactly the same. We'll speed the rest of this up and get on to something else. So now I've got all these slats at the router station here. I've got it set up with a 3/8 bullnose bit. I've got a couple feather boards to hold the slats down and over good and tight. All of these have to be ran through on one side, retrieved, and ran through on the other. Here's a good look at the end of one of the slats once we're done putting the bullnose on both edges of it. Here at the table saw, I've taken the regular blade off and I'm putting on a stacked dado that's 3/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to use this to produce the tenons on the ends of all these slats that we've been producing. All these tenons you're seeing stacked up over here on the table saw will need a matching mortise, which is a negative hole for these positive tenons to all fit into, and they need to be precisely located in the center of the 1-bys that are going to make up the rest of the panel, and they also need precisely located lengthwise down the edge of the bed. So that part is going to be pretty labor intensive just to locate all those, as far as laying them out and then to produce them. So I'm going to try to cheat just a little bit. My thought is I'm going to plow out a groove in the center of those 1-bys, the depth of those tenons, the width of those tenons, and the length of the entire board, rather than having to locate each one down the board. I won't leave it with the channel plowed out in between them. I'm going to fill it back in with small pieces stock that I'm going to produce in one big long piece, and then be able to just chop into precise little lengths and glue those right back into that channel. So here's a look at them all stacked up here. They've been culled through. I actually made about 6 more than what's sitting here, and culled through them, picking out the best grains and first one thing and another. Okay, so now I'm back over at the chop saw, cutting some full 1 by full 2 inch material, 51 3/4 inches long, to produce the upper and lower rails for the front. I've already planed this material to thickness and ripped it on the table saw to the 2 inches. So now I've got some stock that I've ripped on the table saw to 2.5 inches wide by about 7/8 thick. I'm setting a stop block. I'm going to cut 4 of these 22 13/16 long. They are the upper and lower members on the sides of the bed. So the 2 long boards that we started cutting to length at the 51 and change, and these 4 that we're working on currently for the sides of the bed, these are all 6 the pieces that all of the little slats that we produced will interface with. So I need to get those. I need to get these prepped to the point to where we can glue up all of the slats into these and let them be drying so that we can move on to something else. So now we're over at the planer with all of the material that we've cut to length over at the chop saw. We've got all 4 legs and all 6 of the upper and lower pieces that we've cut to length. And all of these pieces have been either ran through the planer or joiner on 3 out of the 4 sides. So now I'm going to orient them where the 4th side gets planed and simultaneously sizes them all to the same size in their groups. There's 2 inch, 2.5 inch, and 3 inch pieces here. Now I've taken all of the pieces that we just ran through the planer over to the drum sander, and I'm going to run all 4 surfaces of these through the drum sander to remove any machining marks that was left behind by the planer and joiner. So now I'm back over at the router station. I've got a 1/4 inch bit in the router, a 1/4 inch straight bit. I've got it set to about 3/8 of an inch deep. I've got it using a feather board to hold it good and secure, and I'm plowing out the groove, which is actually the mortises for the tenons on all of the slats that we've produced. I could have produced the same groove using a dado stack. I just thought it would be easier to use a router rather than have to change the blade out on the table saw again. Then I've got one of the slats. I'm just checking the fit. I'm going to be easing the edges on everything on this baby bed with a 1/4 inch round over bit. And before we put the slat assembly together, I need to get this internal 1/4 inch round over taken care of, because the bearing guide gets in the way and will interfere with the slats once they're in the way. So now I've got the edges eased on all 6 of the pieces that are going to be glued to the slats. I'm starting the glue up process on the longest piece, which is the front of the baby bed. I'm having to work pretty fast. I've got this video sped up just a little bit for entertainment value, but this proved to be a pretty good challenge. There's like 60 something individual pieces, including the little pieces that go in between the slats to fill up the void. And all of that has to be glued up in one go clamp before the glue dries. I'm using Titebond 3 on this project. I could use a slower drying glue. This glue only has an open time of about 20 minutes. I've chosen this glue because when this baby bed is not being used, it may be stored in an outdoor environment, and I don't want it falling apart on them. The first half of this glue up wasn't bad at all, really. I could orient it like you see, where everything was really easy to see and work on. Once I get to the second half, it proved to be a bit more challenging, simply because it was a little harder to gain access to. And of course, I couldn't just turn it upside down like I had the other one. I'd already moistened everything with glue, but I'm going back and getting a little bit of refresh on this second side, just simply because I'd spent so much time on the first side, and I knew this side was probably going to be a little slower than the first. Once I get all the glue on this second side remoistened, then I can start the assembly. I use a clamp to help me. I get the first slat in, and then throw a clamp on the end to hold it fully in, and that allows me to rock the long piece. As it rocks around, it pinches on the next slat, and of course, as I put each slat in, I've got to put the little filler piece in the mortise in between the slats, and it has to be shoved up tight to the tenons because it actually gauges the distance the slats are between each other. And of course, once I get halfway or so, then I can employ a second clamp, and the first half is technically fully engaged, and then it's just a matter of working the last few down and putting all the clamps on. So this is a bead lock router bit. I'm using the Cull slats that I produced. They actually were almost perfect fit to produce these bead locks out of, which we're going to be using a little bit of here in just a minute. So this is a bead lock tenoning jig. I think the popular thing at the moment is something they call dominoes, and this is a little similar, I believe. I think this is a bit simpler and maybe a little lower cost. It's a little bit finicky getting this jig held in the right spot because it's capable of handling up to 3-inch stock. So once you get it locked on, you drill 3 holes, 3/8 diameter, to a particular depth that you desire through this jig, and then you loosen the jig block without loosening the jig, slide it what is equivalent to a half of hole diameter over, and you drill 2 more holes, which drills the bridge out between the 3 holes that you've already produced. It's a little finicky getting the jig set up in the beginning for whatever stock thickness you have. It really requires a couple of scrap pieces to ensure that you have it just right. And then from there, it really only takes 1 mark on each board to witness the jig. So as far as that goes, it isn't really any harder than drilling 1 dowel pin. You can buy this bead lock tenon material already machined and cut to length and all that sort of jazz. I haven't ever bought any. It may be out of beech nut. I'm not sure what their stuff is out of. Usually if I'm working with some white oak and I have some scraps left over, I usually go ahead and make up some of this. Like on cabinet face frames in the past, I've usually made them about 2 inch, and this 1 3/4 beadlock that's 5 wide is usually too much for that. So I usually make some of that material that's 3 beads wide for doing cabinet face frames with, and that seems to work out pretty well. I've cut these pieces of loose tenon about 1.5 inches long, and I've given them just a little bit of sanding on the ends so they don't have real square corners, so they won't try to clean all the glue off of the surfaces and plow it to the bottom. So now I'm just going to get this glued up here, and we'll get these legs put on these sub-assemblies, and once we get that done, we'll have both of the ends of the baby bed nearly complete. They'll just need a little round over bit run around on the edges of them to clean them up a bit. It is a little finicky trying to get just the right amount of glue in this type of joint with the bumpy inside of that mortise. It's really hard to get enough glue down in there and then clean out the excess with anything. You know, that scraper won't clean out enough, and you can't get a brush down in the bottom of it properly. So it's a little tedious to try to get just the right amount of glue on this joint, but I usually err on the side of too much and then have to clean it off with a rag, but that's the way it goes sometimes. We'll get this other leg buttered up with some glue here in just a second and get it assembled and get the clamps on and get this thing drying so we can go around the edges of it with the router, and this sub-assembly will be just about complete and we can move on to something else. This loose tenon does have just a little bit of play in it. Of course, if it were too tight, you couldn't keep enough glue in the joint to be effective. So it really pays off to have good square lumber, so that when you go to this clamping process, all of the boards lay nice and flat across the joint. Of course, here I'm just checking to make sure that is so, and I don't show it here, but I go around and check every one of them. Once I get that and get the excess glue cleaned off of the joints, we have squeeze out on all the joints here, so I've got to mop it all up. That just saves a little time on the back end, trying to scrape it off or sand it off. Of course, I've got a little thin amount left behind from this rag. I will have to sand off, but it won't take that long to get it done. Then, of course, I cross measure to make sure we're good and square. And out of the two of these, I think one of them was about a 1/16 out of square. Here I've got both of the ends out of the clamps and running the round over bit around all of the rest of the corners to soften them up. I'm putting this little round over bit through the workout and having to round over inside and outside of all of these edges. There was quite a bit of it to get done. This will wrap up the front and the two sides though, and we're going to take a look at this drawing for the back. We're going to start by producing the frame for this. Like I said in the beginning, this is in a stile and rail fashion, so we're going to be using bits just like you'd use on cabinets to produce these. Here I've got all of the components for the back of the bed, the headboard I'm going to call it, worked up. Now I'm just going to run them through the planer to ensure that they're all the same width of boards, and we can start getting that frame worked up. We're going to start this back panel by producing the frame, and the joints on it will all be stile and rail. So I'm installing a bit in the shaper here. This is shaker stile and rail bit. This is one of those reversible economy bits. Here I'm just trying to get it all set in the shaper, getting the height right and getting the fence depth set right so we can start producing the rails for this. After I get it set where I think I want it, I always take a scrap piece of the same dimension lumber I'm going to use and run a test piece. That way I can get measurements off of the actual piece and see where we're laying. Just checking here and making sure I've got a 1/4 inch in the back and a 1/4 inch groove, and we ought to be ready to start running the real material here. Here I've got the material for the frame of the headboard laid out like it's going to be, and I'm putting some witness marks where I want the machining on the rails to stop, because I don't want it to go all the way to the floor. I want it to stop just below the bottom stile. So now I'm making the first rail cut here on this, what's going to be a leg. So I'm having to plunge cut into it. There's my witness mark that I don't want to go beyond. Of course, I have to go far enough for the bottom of the groove to be there, or I'll have to cut all that out by hand to square it up. So I'm just going to let that kind of run out down there. The shaker style bit produces a pretty basic joint. No fancy beads or coves or anything, but it ought to be pretty good for a baby bed headboard though. It should be easy to clean and not very many sharp corners and that sort of thing. The second rail / leg, I was able to start at the end rather than having to make a plunge cut, and then I just pull it off of the bit short of getting to the end. Here I'm doing the center rail, which splits the panels into 2 pieces. So it's got the joint on both long sides of it to accept the 2 panels. And in the drawing I had it laid out as 3 inch, and 3 inch was the narrowest I could have that board and have the panels still small enough that I could run them through my sander. I ended up deciding to make this board 6 inch. I thought it would look a little better balanced. I've got just a couple more of these boards that need ran with this profile, and then as you can see here, I've swapped the bit around to where it has the same profile as we just cut on the boards. So this is what's called the coping cut. This will be cut on the end grain of the boards that joint with the rails. Here I've got a scrap piece I'm running to check and make sure of my alignment before I start using my good pieces, and I'm just going to check the fit here and see how it's coming along. Looks like I'm about ready to start running the real board. So here's that 6 inch piece that's going to be in the middle dividing the 2 panels, and it has the cope on both ends of it because it sits in 2 of those long rails. So both ends of this divider board and both ends of the top and bottom rail members in this frame get this coping profile on them. Once I get these joints made, the frame of the headboard will be finished and we'll be ready to move on to building the panels for the headboard. Here's a quick look at the frame just dry fitted together. So now that we've got this far, we can figure out the exact size of our panels. So the grooves that we've plowed out in all these boards is 3/8 deep. So total is 3/4 across the width. But I only want the panel to go in 1/4 inch into the 3/8 to allow for expansion of the panel. So here I've got all my panel material cut roughly to size, not exact. I'll finalize it on the table saw down the road. But I've got it all pretty close, and got one panel glued up. These panels will be fully raised, meaning that the front surface will be flush with the front surface of the rails. I have planed it down thin enough where it won't have the back 1/4 inch that you usually have to cut a relief for. So I did that to try to lighten this headboard up just a little bit, because it's pretty big, it's pretty heavy. I've got this material worked down pretty close to where I want it for final thickness, and these panels are going to be too big to run back through the planer once they're glued together. So I'm trying to do a really good job of making sure all of my joints are flat and even, and the panel is flat as well. Because the last thing I'm going to do here, once I get them out of the clamps, I'm going to run them through my drum sander, and it'll do a good job of sanding them. It won't do a very good job of flattening the panels out. So here we are the next day. Panels are dry. We're going to pull them out of the clamps here. And I've got glue down the joints here where it's leaked out of the joint as it dried. I'm going to scrape it all off of the surface here, so when I run them through the sander, I don't gum up my sandpaper. So I'm going to just give you a quick sample of that, and then we'll move on to the drum sander and get these things cleaned up nicely. It took a fair while to get these how I wanted them through the drum sander, and of course it's pretty slow, and you can't take a very big bite with as wide of material as we're running. So here's the panel raising bit I'm going to be using. It's a 5.5 inch diameter shaker style panel bit. I'm making 3 progressively deeper cuts with this panel raising bit. I'm starting out pretty shallow, and then once I run all the edges on both the panels, I'll reset the bit and run them again, and so on until I get the final depth. And the final depth will leave us a 1/4 inch tongue that's flat for 3/8 of an inch, and then of course the taper of the raised panel. This machine and the bit would handle taking all this material off in one pass. However, with this white oak, I'm a little concerned of chip out, tear out, blow out, whatever you want to try to call it. Here's a look at one of the panels after the first pass on all 4 sides. That's where you take off a considerable amount of the materials right there on that corner. So now I'm making an adjustment to the machine and going to run them all through again. There's a little different perspective on the cutting going on. Because of the large diameter of this bit, I've only got it running 5,500 RPM, whereas if you had a small router bit, it'd be running like 25,000. So now I've got all of the parts machined for this headboard. I've also got them all pre-sanded. You know, the stiles and rails and the raised panel themselves are pretty finicky to try to get it all sanded once it's assembled. So I went through and got everything pre-sanded just as much as I can. So now it's just a matter of keeping glue off of everything while I get it glued up here. This glue up wasn't too bad. It was a little difficult working with one hand. It would have been easier if I'd have had a helper, but all of the pieces fit well and everything went together nice and square and everything. These are, of course, floating panels. They're not glued into this frame. They're so big, if you was to try to glue them in here, when the wood moves with the seasons, it would break itself apart. Once I get the top and bottom fitted on here, the rest of it's really falls together really easily. It's a matter of just getting all this lined up. You know, it's kind of like trying to put together two cabinet doors at the same time. And I go ahead and get one clamp right here in the middle on this stile that's in the middle of the doors. This will lock everything together where nothing will be shifting around on me while I get the other stiles glued up and clamped on here. I'm really working at it, trying to put just the right amount of glue, not too little, not too much on these cope joints, in order to have it where when I clamp them up, I don't really have any squeeze out that I'm going to have to clean out of all the little corners. That is such a pain to try to dig out of the corners. I got these old black iron pipe clamps. I don't want them to get anything on the blonde wood because it's already been sanded, so I put some spacers in it just to hold those pipes off of the wood while I've got it clamped up here. I know in the video it looks like I'm gluing and clamping this and then turning right around and taking the clamps off, but it was in the clamps for about 5 hours that day before I pulled it out of the clamps and give it a final sanding. I'm just doing a quick little sand here just to make sure that the joints are all nice and flat and there's no glue residue, because, you know, when I go to varnishing, any of that glue is going to turn white, really stand out on those joints. Here I'm using a wood chisel to clean out anything that I had leak out in the corners. Next, I'm working on drilling for all of the mechanical fasteners. I bought this little old kit with some screws. I forget what, they're actually metric, but they're about 1/4 inch, like 1/4 inch machine screws. They've got a pan head, and they're gonna go through these end panels and into a nut plate, I'm gonna call it, that'll be located in the corners of the front panel of the bed. So I'm drilling just about an 1/8 inch deep with a 1/2 inch diameter Forstner bit, so that that head of that pan head screw will actually sit just inside the wood. And then I'm drilling back through the center of that with a 1/4 inch bit to go all the way through the wood. Once I get all these drilled out, then I move to the front of the baby bed and I drill the holes that those screws will go in, about 2 inches deep down in here. And then I turn around and drill the face ones. These are the ones that the nut plate's gonna go in. Now, the nut plate is actually round, just like that hole. It's approximately 3/8 of an inch in diameter. So you put the nut plate in from one direction and the screw in from the other, And so in order to have that joint fail, that whole corner of the oak board would have to fail. Next, I'm drilling and installing some nut plates in the ends. These are what's going to support the bed spring frame in 3 different height locations. So these little old nut plates have really coarse threads on the outside of them and fine threads for the screws on the inside of them. I was really surprised at how good a bite those got, those coarse threads into this oak, no deeper than they're going into it. They only go about a 1/2 inch deep. Once I get these in, this will wrap up all the mechanical fasteners that I'm going to need for the bed. So I'm going to give everything one quick look over for sanding and move on to putting a finish on it. So I decided to spray this since it has so many nooks and crannies. So I've moved it down to my sawmill shed. I've got this large overhang that I was able to hang it up and spray it. My air compressor doesn't reach this building. I didn't have enough hose. So as you can see in the background there, I used a little old generator and a tiny air compressor, so I had to keep stopping and waiting on the air compressor to catch up with me. What I'm using for finish on this bed is it's actually hardwood floor finish. Of course, there's nowhere on it that talks about spraying it on. It's supposed to be put on with like a squeegee or a mop type thing. But I like it really well. It's low VOC. It lays really well, and I've used it out of spray application several times in the past and really like it. And it's a really durable finish. Spraying it like this, I was able to put 3 coats on it in an afternoon with sanding in between each coat. So literally by the time I got the last piece sprayed, I was able to pick up sandpaper. Well, I guess I took about a 5-minute break and then picked up sandpaper and started sanding the first piece. And went through and sanded them all with them hanging there with 320 and put on two more consecutive coats past what we're looking at here. Hey, if you've made it this far in the video, I really appreciate you sticking with it till the end. This will probably be the last woodworking video for a while. The next video out will more than likely be on sawmilling.